And joining me now in our Lagos studio, we have the Director General, Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Muda Yusuf, to discuss more on this. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Yusuf.
Now, happy independence.
Same to you. We listened to the President's speech and he touched on very important issues, salient issues. He touched on macroeconomic stability and also diversification. But in the whole, let's start off the conversation. What do you make of his speech today?
Well, first, let me say that we need to congratulate ourselves that we are celebrating this independence at 59. And again, we have had this democracy uninterrupted for 20 years. This is the longest stretch of democratic experience that we have had. Because all over the world, democratic governments are better respected. And generally, in spite of all the failings that we have, investors have greater confidence in a democratic government than maybe in a military government or whatever. So I think that we have to recognize that. Secondly, we have seen some upsides over time. We have seen some improvement in the service sector area, particularly in the financial services sector, for instance.
As well as the telecoms as well.
The telecoms, a major transformation has taken place in that space. In the entertainment industry, we have seen significant movement. Even in the media, I mean, there has been significant investment in the media. We cannot compare the media industry maybe 20, 30 years ago to what we have today. So there are some upsides that we can recognize. But generally, the speech is very good. I mean, these are the kind of things we like to hear. And these are the kind of things that we have also been hearing from government. The major challenge has been the gap between what we say and what actually happens.
And talking about what we say and what actually happens on ground, now we look at investment within the non-oil sector. We've not necessarily seen an aggressive push. That's the view of economic watchers. And you also rightly pointed out that looking at the structure of our economy, the long over-reliance on oil and gas and the proceeds that come from there has just blindsided us to other areas as well. Look at agriculture, look at manufacturing, look at the services. You made mention of all of those. Now, the president prides himself in saying that Nigeria successfully has 9 quarters out of recession. We have our external reserves at about $42 billion, away from the $23 billion we recorded in 2016. And much more, we've been able to have a stabilized exchange rate as well. But really now, looking at how to address investment within the non-oil sector, what are your expectations in terms of the policy mix taking us forward?
Well, the non-oil sector, just as we said in our own report, contributes significantly to our GDP. We are talking about something in the range of 90% of GDP, going by the last report of the National Bureau of Statistics. But it contributes less than 50% or thereabouts of revenue. What that tells you is that the productivity in the non-oil sector is still very, very low. You can give it to this administration. There has been a lot of talk, a lot of commitment to some extent, a lot of financial intervention trying to boost the non-oil economy. But fundamentally, the progress we are making in the non-oil sector is still extremely slow. That is why the capacity of the sector to compete is very weak. That is why the cost of production generally is also very high. That is why there are general problems of competitiveness in the non-oil sector. And unless we address, and these are very fundamental things, because if we are talking about diversifying the economy, we need to address the fundamental issues that will make the diversification possible.
And attract investment.
And attract investment. And at the heart of all of this is our investment in infrastructure. Take even the normal elementary integration within the domestic economy. Over time, we have been talking about regional integration. Lately, we are talking about continental integration. But even national integration of the economy, we still have a big challenge. That is our ability to move goods from one part of the country to the other. And unless you begin to integrate the economy, even domestically, you cannot have the kind of value you can have from this kind of large market. Because the beauty of an economy is for the ability of economic players to interact.
And talking
so
about...
there's a major limitation as far as integration infrastructure is concerned, as far as production infrastructure, particularly power and all of these critical issues. We have been talking a lot about it, but the issue is the strategy to deliver them. I'm not sure we'll be able to get it right.
And are you impressed with the president's stance as well? He says that 1.74 trillion naira has been released for the fiscal year 2018, and in the next 3 months we should also have another 600 billion naira as well. He says there are other tax incentives here and there for road infrastructure to have much more partnership with the private sector.
Well, I think that goes to underscore the commitment of the government to developing infrastructure and also funding the capital budget. But when we compare these numbers with the deficit that we have in the capital expenditure space or in the infrastructure space, it's a very big gap. And the government has said it repeatedly that we have a major revenue problem. As it is almost degenerating into a fiscal crisis. In fact, some commentators have talked about issues of solvency, both at the federal and the state government, that many of them are now at the threshold of being insolvent. So we need to deal with the issues of revenue optimization. Is very, very critical. We need to deal with the issues of cost of governance. We need to deal with the issues of fiscal leakages. And we need to deal with issues of investment.
How now?
I say investment because it is investors that will give you the revenue. There's a limit to which you can get from, okay, oil and gas is there, but it's also not very reliable. There's a limit to which you can depend on portfolio flows. Because the president talked about the stability in the exchange rate, he talked about the reserves. A major component of these things are portfolio investments. And portfolio investments are volatile. They are hot money.
Anything can happen any minute.
Anything can happen, you know? So if you have that situation, and no matter what we say, this economy is still largely dependent on oil.
Now, the president also made mention of the fact that he expects a whole lot of information, a whole lot of advice from the Economic Advisory Council that he just newly established. What is also your expectation in terms of having the right macroeconomic stability to first of all have investment and also boost local production in the country?
You see, the policy environment has a major role to play in inspiring the confidence of investors. It is when the confidence grows, that is when you can have investors. And when I talk about investors, I mean investors that will put something concrete on the ground. I mean domestic direct investors and foreign direct investors. These are the kind of investors that we desire at this time. These are the kind of investors that will give you jobs, that will help you to alleviate poverty, that will promote economic diversification, that will promote economic inclusion. These things are key. So the advice coming from the Economic Advisory Council will play a big role in defining the level of confidence that these investors will have. And the challenge is that we are likely to see a bit of a conflict because the body of economic advisors are purely technical people. They are technocrats. All of them are economists. So, and to some extent, we have some political economy issues in the management of the economy. For instance, we are talking of reform in the oil and gas sector. Most times there are serious political resistance to reforming the sector. You know, if you talk of some other sectors like PPP and so on, there are needs for urgent reforms in those areas. So we need to be ready to take some very serious decisions, sometimes some very hard decisions, which are likely to come from this economic advisor. So my take will be that if the president gives the advisors enough scope in terms of giving, I don't have any doubt as to the quality of the advice that will come. What I'm worried about is, first, ability to accept those advice, then the political will to implement the advice. Because at a time like this, we need to build an economy that is sustainable. What we have today is not a sustainable economy. We have to live not just for today, we have to also live for tomorrow. We have to think of our children, we need to think of our great-grandchildren and so on. And unless we structure the economy in a way that we invest properly in the sustainability of the economy, we may be putting the future in jeopardy.
And talking about investments now, the president also said in addressing one of the biggest elephants we've had in the Nigerian economy, the power situation in the country, the president said in August we launched the Presidential Power Initiative to modernize the national grid, and in 3 phases. So by now, until the end of this year, we should expect 5 to 7 gigawatts of power. By 2023, he pegs it at about 11. And beyond 2023, he expects that will be somewhere around 25 gigawatts of power. And he says this is as a result of the partnership with the German government as well. He touched on having meters, smart meters being made, and also looking at distribution within the sector. Do you think that is enough to convince investors that we are also taking the power sector seriously?
I think the government is taking the power sector seriously. But it is one thing to have an aspiration. It's another thing to have the right kind of strategy to deliver on the outcomes that you expect. The power sector issue, well, we are still grappling with a lot of issues. There are serious legal issues following from the power sector reform. Because I'm aware that at a point when Mr. Fashola, when he was combining power with his portfolio, he made a lot of attempts to ensure that we break through, we break away from, this logjam of the discos and all of them holding us down. But there were all sorts of litigation that arose from it. So we need to look at the legal framework properly and to see how this Siemens model or this Siemens intervention can fit into the current framework, so that you don't run into other issues with the GENCOs, with the DISCOs, and saying that how do you just bring an investor to superimpose on them and so on. And of course, we still have the issues of the transmission facilities, transmission infrastructures. So the framework for the intervention is something that we need to tidy up properly. It is good to say some of these things, but when it comes to the execution, you may be encountering some problems. So we need to tidy up the framework, both the legal framework and the framework for the implementation and execution of the proposal that the president has put on the table. But surely, what the president has said is a demonstration of his commitment to ensure that we do something concrete about the power sector. But what matters to Nigerians and to business is the results. Exactly. Let's have the power.
And talking about results as well, one of your advice to government as well is in the area of foreign exchange. You said we should have streamlining of foreign exchange management. What exactly are you trying to communicate?
You see, the foreign exchange management is very critical to investment. The signaling that you give to foreign investors in particular is very important. Because if you don't manage your foreign exchange market well, you cannot inspire the confidence of investors. Because if investors come into your country, they are looking at, of course, at what rate are they bringing their money in, at what rate are they taking it out, and how easy will it be if they bring in their money and they want to take it out. So unless you have a foreign exchange market, first, that ensures liquidity, that ensures confidence, that also ensures that the exchange rate reflects the fundamentals of the market. It has to be market-driven. And all these issues of multiple windows, multiple rates, we need to streamline them. The more you have this kind of multiplicity, or either of windows or of rates, the more you create some doubts, the more you create a confidence problem among investors. So we need to streamline all these rates and make sure that we have a unified rate as much as possible. We also need to ensure that this idea of putting 305 or 306 in the budget as a benchmark for converting the foreign exchange earnings into Naira is also not right.
You say it's not realistic enough?
No, it's not right. It's not that it's not realistic, it's not right. Because it understates the revenue equivalent that goes into the federation account. You cannot be saying that we don't have revenue, and yet we are shortchanging ourselves by the kind of conversion that we do. If the market rate is 360, how can the conversion rate be 305? And if you look at the medium-term expenditure framework, we have 305 between now and 2022. How can that be? So these are fundamental issues that we need to deal with. And I'm sure that by the time the Economic Advisory Council comes on board, these are some of the critical reform propositions that we put before the president for him to.
And while the president spoke, we did not necessarily hear anything about strategic steps to also be taken to reduce borrowing. That has also been another issue with the LCCI and the advice to government: we must reduce borrowing. Going forward, what are your expectations?
You see, the issue of borrowing is a very frightening thing, because already the borrowing cost is getting close to 3 trillion annually. Again, if you look at the medium-term expenditure framework, the borrowing cost for 2020 is about 3.7 or 3.8. You know? So, no, 2.8.
2.8,
Yeah, 2.8,
thereabouts.
2.9. Yeah, getting close to 3 trillion. That is huge. When we are struggling to have a capital budget of even 1 point something, 1.7, 1 point, under 2 trillion. So the way to deal with that is to ensure that whatever we are borrowing for, if there are alternative sources of funding for those infrastructure, let us explore those alternatives. If there are private sector funds that can come into the delivery of some of those things, let us explore those opportunities. Because the president in his speech also talked about creating a much better environment for public-private partnership, so that the government can harness a lot more of private capital. So we'll be looking at equity funding for some of those things rather than borrowing. You should identify infrastructure projects that are bankable. Some of them, no doubt, are not bankable. But if there are ones that are bankable, and if there are ones that the social costs of handing over to the private sector will not be too high, we should hand them over to the private sector and inspire confidence. Because the issue with private sector participation in infrastructure is about confidence. Because we are talking about huge sums of investment. We are talking about a large gestation period. We can be talking about an investment that will take 30 years for you to recoup. So unless you create the environment that inspires the confidence of the investors, those kind of capital will not come. So we need to harness all these opportunities so that we can reduce the amount of borrowing that we are incurring. That is very key.
And it's been quite a whole lot of pot of information there that you've let out there. And very soon we'll see Mr. Muda Yusuf as well as part of the Economic Advisory team. Thank you very much for your time. We've been speaking with the Director General of the Lagos State Chamber of